Hello and welcome to History. On Friday, you guys, we started the first lesson in Domain 12, Fighting for a Cause, and that was just kind of an overview of some of the people that we're going to be focusing on this unit. Today, we are going to be talking about this woman right here, and if you remember, her name is Susan B. Anthony, and she is an advocate for women's rights. So, today our objectives are describe the life and contributions of Susan B. Anthony, identify the main causes for which Susan B. Anthony fought during her lifetime, explain the term suffrage, identify Susan B. Anthony as an abolitionist, and explain why Susan B. Anthony's campaign for women's rights, especially the right to vote. As always, we're going to talk about our vocabulary. Our vocabulary terms are abolitionist, which are people who work to end slavery; ballots, slips of paper used to cast or record votes; influential, having the ability to persuade someone; jury, a group of people selected to listen to evidence in a trial and decide on a verdict; and suffrage, the right to the vote. So let's take a minute. Remember that this is Susan B. Anthony, and in the previous lesson we learned that Susan B. Anthony helped people, and she fought for women, and she believed that women should be allowed to vote. She dedicated her whole life to make sure that the world was a fairer place for women. Today we are going to hear more about Susan B. Anthony, and I want you guys to take a minute to look at this photograph. What do you think she's doing there? Whatever she is doing, whatever is an image, this picture shows Susan doing something that took a lot of courage. So today I want you to listen carefully to hear what Susan B. Anthony did to make the world a fairer place for women, and to learn what other cause Susan worked during her lifetime. So Susan B. Anthony was born a very long time ago in Massachusetts in the year 1820. She was a little girl. She did not know that she would grow up to be, when she was a little girl, she did not know that she would grow up to become someone so influential. And influential means the ability to change people's mind or convince them of something. But that was to be her destiny. Her family certainly helped to shape the person she was to become. There we go. Susan's family was different from many families. They were Quakers. Quakers are members of a religious group called the Religious Society of Friends. Quakers believe that all people were equal. Susan's family did not judge people based on the color or whether they were female or male. In their eyes, everyone was equal. But a long time ago, when Susan was a young girl, not everyone thought that way. For one thing, many people thought that it was more important for boys to be educated than it was for girls or people of color. How would you have felt about that? How would you feel if boys could only go to school? Susan was lucky because her parents did not agree with this view. They wanted their daughter to receive a good education. When Susan was 6 years old, she went to school. One day, a teacher at the school refused to teach Susan a difficult math problem because she was a girl. As a result, her parents decided that Susan should be educated at home. Later, Susan attended a Quaker boarding school near Philadelphia. A boarding school is a school where a student lives at school rather than goes home at the end of each day. So they kind of live there for the school year. Later, Susan attended a Quaker boarding school near Philadelphia. When her parents struggled to pay the fees, however, she left school and finished her education at home. Later, Susan became a teacher. Susan eventually became the head mistress or the person in charge of a school. Susan worked hard to help her family financially. Susan quickly discovered, though that most female teachers earned less money than male teachers for doing the very same job. So she was saying that if you were a male teacher, you made more money than the female teachers. The female teachers automatically got less money. When Susan was 29 years old, she left the world of education and settled in her family home. Susan's family was now living near Rochester, New York. It was different this time that she met some very brave people who were trying to abolish or end slavery in the United States. You learned about slavery in our social studies unit about the Civil War. So when people are forced to work with no pay and they are not free to make decisions about their own lives, remember that was what slavery was. So she met people that were trying to abolish or end slavery. These people were called abolitionists, and abolitionists are people who would want to get rid of slavery. Secret meetings were held late at night in her family home. Susan became involved too. Her heart began to tell her that it was important that she tried to make the world a fairer place. So Susan decided that she would join the fight to abolish slavery. A long and difficult journey had begun. In the early days of the Civil War, Susan helped to organize women's groups and speak out about slavery. This was not an easy thing to do. Back then, people did not have computers or cell phones. Susan and her supporters had to travel in horse-drawn carriages and communicate by letter. Newspapers printed many articles that criticized her views and called her a troublemaker. Susan did not care. She was fearless. While the Civil War raged in January 1863, President Abraham Lincoln took an important step toward ending slavery. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This proclamation, or statement, announced that government intended to free all slaves in the United States. This meant that former slaves could make decisions about their own lives and that they could receive money for the work they did. In December 1865, after the Civil War, slavery was abolished or ended completely. In the next few years after the Civil War, the law was changed so that former slaves became citizens and male slaves were given the right to vote. Susan was very happy that former male slaves had gained these rights. She was extremely happy that women did. She was extremely unhappy that women did not have the same rights. The next fight was about to begin. So for Susan and many others, they did not want to fight like the kind of violent fights that happen in a war. For them, the fight was one which they would work hard to end the unfairness they show. So she was happy that slavery was abolished. And male slaves now had the right to vote. But the thing that she did not like was the fact that women did not have the right to vote. So that is the next problem that the issue that she was trying to fix. So it might be difficult to believe now, but when Susan was alive, women had very few rights. As you have discovered, back then many people did not think that it was important to educate girls. Women who had very limited roles or small jobs in their communities. They could attend meetings but were not allowed to speak in public, hold office, or vote. Women were not allowed to become doctors or lawyers. Few girls stayed in school beyond the 8th grade. Married women could not own property. If they did own property before they got married, they had to turn it over to their husband after they got married. Yep, that's right. If they did own property, they would have to then give the property once they got married to their husband. Susan had hoped that former abolitionists would now support women's rights. She was disappointed to discover that many men who had helped to abolish slavery did not believe that women should have suffrage or the right to vote. Susan was determined to change this view. Susan joined forces with two women named Amelia Boomer, which is the woman on the left, this woman right here, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which is the woman on the right. Together, they began to fight for women's rights. Women like Susan, who campaigned against these laws, became known as suffragists, or people who fought for the women's suffrage. So remember, suffrage is the right to vote. So they wanted to make sure that women got the right to vote just like men. Susan became secretary of the American Equal Rights Association. She traveled all over the country by wagon, carriage, and train, speaking for women's suffrage. She organized petitions and clubs, and she wrote newspaper articles. Susan also became the publisher of The Revolution, a newspaper dedicated to women's issue. So a publisher is a person in charge of the newspaper. So they kind of are like the principal of a school. They're like the principal of the newspaper, basically. Printed on the front of the page of this newspaper were the words, "Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing less." Susan invested her own money in the newspaper, continuing the fight for women's rights. Susan also helped to Susan also helped to found or start the National Suffrage Association. When Susan ran out of money, she gave up her position at the newspaper and had to find another way to make money. She began to tour the country, speaking to groups that paid to speak to her. Susan was in her 50s when she took her campaign one step further. She tried to cast her vote for president. The word cast here means the act of voting. So she wanted to vote, so she went and voted. She and several other women marched into the New York barber shop where male voters were voting. A barber shop is a place where people, usually men, go to get their hair cut. But at this time, this was like a place that they could go and vote. And it was in a barber shop because most of the time men went to barber shops. They were for men. Nowadays, it's a little different, but at this time, it was mostly for men. The women held a protest. They demanded the right to vote. The men in charge were unsure of what to do. They were unable to stop the women, so the women finally voted in the election. And so, in 1872, about 50 years before it was legal to do so, Susan and the other women cast their ballots, which are the pieces of paper in their hands, and the pieces of paper which are used to cast the votes. So they used to cast their votes or their ballots for the President of the United States. So it wasn't legal, but do you see how there's a lock on the box? That only few people would have the ability to open that to count because they didn't want anybody cheating, right? So their vote was in there. 2 weeks later, Susan was arrested and charged with illegal voting. Her arrest caused a national uproar. Susan was not afraid. She asked a general public to consider, is it a crime for a United States citizen to vote? The judge in the trial did not think women should have the right to vote. He decided against Susan before the trial even started. He did not talk to her. He ordered a jury to find her guilty. Remember, a jury is the group of people who sit at a trial to decide whether or not someone is guilty of a crime in which they were charged. So he ordered the jury, without even letting them hear what she had to say she's guilty. Is that right? He then asked Susan if she had anything to say. So here's a picture of a courtroom. This isn't the one that everything happened just a minute ago, but this is just to give you kind of a little background where the jury would sit over here, and it says juries or jurors. So this is where the jury would sit. If there was an audience, people would sit here. The judge would sit here. Whoever is being questioned by some of the lawyers would be here. Okay? I have many things to say, for in your ordered verdict of guilty, you have trampled underfoot every vital principle of our government. My natural rights, my civil rights, my political rights, my judicial rights are all alike ignored. So Susan was saying that her rights were being violated, not only because she could not legally vote, but because the judge didn't even let her talk on her own trial. So they were not giving her a fair trial, which is one of our rights, right? We learned about. The judge tried to quiet Susan, but she continued to speak. He sentenced her to pay a fine of $100. Susan's response was to say, I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty. And she never did. By the end of the 19th century, or the late 1800s, people's views about Susan B. Anthony began to change. She had become a national hero. Susan continued to travel the country speaking for women's voting rights. Now people couldn't wait to hear her speak. She became president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, a job she held until the age of 80 when she retired. 6 years later, on March 13th, 1906, Susan B. Anthony died in Rochester, New York. She had worked for more than 50 years and half of a century for women's rights. Although she did not live to see women get the right to vote when the 19th Amendment to the Constitution passed in 1920, she had helped to make it happen. So she died 1906, and finally the Constitution passed, the 19th Amendment, which was giving women the right to vote, 1920. So she died 14 years before the right to vote for women came into effect. That's kind of sad, right? Susan B. Anthony was quite an amazing woman. She was prepared to stand up and fight for what she believed was right. Do you think you would have enough courage to do the same? So let's think about this. Let's think about what causes did Susan B. Anthony vote for. There were two of them. One was before what we just talked about, which was the freedom for all slaves. The second one was women's right to vote. From an early age, Susan B. Anthony believed that everyone should have equal rights. Why did she do this? Why did she feel that everyone should? Remember that her family, they were Quakers, and that was the religion, kind of, that they lived by. And she was raised a Quaker and believed that everyone was equal. And so that's why all these things that she did was for the point of making sure people were treated the same. Did Susan find that everyone was treated equal when she went to school? Do you remember? No. Remember that she saw that boys and girls were treated differently at school, and more importantly, that the boys got more attention and received more instruction than the girls. Did Susan find that everyone was treated equally when she started to become a teacher? No. Remember, she found that, like other female teachers, that Susan did the same work as male teachers, but she got paid less. What was an abolitionist? Do you guys remember? Is someone who fights to abolish or end slavery. So why do you think Susan B. Anthony became an abolitionist? Well, her whole thing was she wanted everyone to be equal, right? She believed that all people should have equal rights. So she wanted everyone to have the same freedoms that she had. Why do you think Susan started a newspaper? Well, people read newspapers to understand what's going on, right? So she probably wanted to start a newspaper so she could get her message out to as many people as possible. And apart from her newspaper, how else did Susan B. Anthony fight for women's rights? She traveled the country, gave speeches, organized clubs. She wrote petitions. She wrote newspaper articles. And she tried to vote. Okay. So, this is what you are going to be doing right now. Here you are going to draw a little picture of Susan B. Anthony. I'm going to explain this part in just a second. Basically, this page was on this lesson was all about Susan B. Anthony. So what you are going to do is the main cause is what we're going to talk about in a minute. What were the important events that went on in the story that you just heard? Okay, so one of them was she was an abolitionist. What were the other things that led her to what happened, like from the beginning? Okay, think about what about her family? She was raised as a Quaker, so she believed everybody should have the same rights. She remember she was a teacher, so things like that. The teacher noticed that people weren't getting enough money if you were a woman, blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to go over everything because I think you guys need to reflect on what you heard. So here you're going to either write about what a ballot is or draw a picture. Here you're going to say, do you think words are a good way to fight for equality or for a cause, and explain? So think about, are words good enough to fight for something? Do you need to use violence? So the part that I said that you were going to skip for this second, I'm going to explain now. So you guys are going to see all of these little slips on a page. And what you are going to do is you are going to pick whichever slip is the right one, and you are going to move it over to the area over here. Okay? So it is promoted civil rights in a nonviolent way, women's rights to vote and freedom for all slaves, education for African American young people, human rights, make sure all people are treated equally and fairly, racial discrimination in sports, protested segregation on city buses and demanded equal rights, and the rights of migrant farmers. So only one of those little strips fit this story that we listened to today. So think about which one would fit, and it's going to go right here. Okay? So that is all that I have for you today. I hope you guys have an awesome day. Thank you for listening. I will have another lesson for you tomorrow. Love you all. Bye.